Excellent. I'll take myself off. We're going to give a few minutes to allow people to trickle in. Excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm Michelle. I am the director of programming with Indie Design Week. And I want to welcome you guys to coming to this amazing topic with Dr. Colin Gray. You can call him Colin. I checked with him beforehand. Um, I will be moderating today's session for Ethics Meets Design, Navigating UX, Dark Patterns, and Regulation. We're going to be exploring how design decisions impact user trust, especially when ethical concerns meet legal and regulatory frameworks. He's going to focus on dark patterns, deceptive UX practices, and share insights from a recent pilot project, along with some real world experiences as a consultant on US legal cases. So you'll get to walk away with strategies to embed your ethics into your design process, understand how regulation is evolving, and learn how ethical awareness can create innovation. So let me tell you a little bit about our presenter today. Dr. Colin Gray is an associate professor in the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at Indiana University, Bloomington, where they are also the director of the Human Computer Interaction Design Program. They hold appointments as guest professor at Beijing Normal University and visiting researcher at Northumbria University. Colin's research focuses on the ways in which the pedagogy, something in my mouth, and use of designs inform the development of design ability, particularly in relation to ethics, design knowledge, and design methods. Colin's research and engagement activities cross multiple disciplines, including human computer interaction, instructional design and technology, law and policy, design theory and education, and engineering and technology education. Without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Colin Gray, or Colin if you would like to call him, take off.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really delighted to chat with all of you today. We're going to talk about ethics meets design. The ethics specific piece is going to come closer to the end of the talk, and you'll hopefully see why. We're going to start out with a lot of things that are wrong with the internet, and a particular focus on this concept of dark patterns, which is increasingly under legal and regulatory scrutiny. Now, there is a Q&A option in front of you, and I would encourage you to use it. I think only I can see the questions that come in, and so don't be shy to add questions or add comments, and I'll try to answer them as we go through the talk, or just let you know that we'll be discussing that in 15 minutes or something like that, so that we can keep the session as engaged and active as we possibly can. So this has been some of my work that has been in progress for the better part of a decade. And so a lot of this goes all the way back to the year 2016, when I was a new assistant professor at Purdue University at the time. And I was starting to think about how I can approach this issue of ethics and design. And it was a really big topic that I wanted to take on. And at the time, very quaint, I was like, I need to write a smaller grant to address some of these issues. And so I focused on this emergent idea of dark patterns, which was relatively well known in the UX practitioner literature at the time, but really hadn't been touched by academics. And so what you see here is an early sketch from some of my lab members, really talking about all the different ways in which we were going to describe what was happening with dark patterns, what dark patterns are and what they're not, why designers do bad things, what end users are experiencing when they're experiencing these problematic practices online, and what we might be able to do about it as well. We had big goals, big dreams. But let's start by grounding this idea of dark patterns in some examples, as designers like to do. So here's one example. This is courtesy of the Dark Patterns tip line, which is run by some people out at Stanford and Consumer Reports. And this is an example of the Consumer Reports website actually trying to sell something. If you notice, there's a dark pattern in play, and we're so used to seeing these that it might be like, oh, there's nothing wrong with this at all. It's totally normal. But if you notice, right underneath that big green upgrade button, there's a no thanks option. And what they're doing is they're playing around with visual hierarchy to make it look like the upgrade option is the preferred path and the no thanks is the not preferred path. And they're doing lots of things to do this. One of those looks like a button, the one in green. The other one just looks like underlined text, more like a link. They're also creating a manipulation of the choice architecture, making it obvious which one you should pick. And many people might actually miss the fact that there's a no thanks altogether. And this is a dark pattern. This is a classic form of interface interference. Here's another example. Thank you to GDPR for bringing us consent banners. This is not a lawful consent banner, but we see many of these in the US still, because the regulatory regime here looks a little bit different. And here, if you're going to voxmedia.com, trying to interact with this website, they are saying you are being tracked and you don't have an option about it. Your only choice is to say, I accept with that purple button. There is no way to say, I don't accept, or can I maybe opt out of some of those trackers. You just have to leave the website. And this is called a consent wall, which we've described in some of our previous work. Again, illegal in the US, in the UK, in the EU, not so illegal here. And one final example, when you're trying to get encouraged to sign up for Amazon Prime, and you'll see Amazon Prime come back as a theme a little bit later. You'll notice that they're in the yellow text, they're saying get fast free delivery, free in all caps, save $6.99. That sounds fabulous. You could say no thanks, but it's obvious you should get the fast free delivery. You don't realize until you click on that little see all link where the text is running off the screen that you're actually signing up for a recurring subscription. And in fact, they trapped many consumers into getting these recurring subscriptions, specifically because they were engaging in a form of sneaking, and in particular here, hiding important information that would be really important to making an informed choice. So as you can probably see, dark patterns are all around us, and there are many different things. And so here are two classic definitions. The one on the bottom comes from Harry Brignall, the person who invented the term back in 2010. And he described them as user interface tricks that trick a user into doing things that they wouldn't otherwise do, and that they're carefully crafted with a solid understanding of human psychology, and they don't have the business's best interests in mind. So this is obviously very oriented towards a designer because they're using this idea of human psychology and understanding it better, which is one of the big goals of UX practitioners, and that they're using these user interface tricks in the form of patterns, just like we see in design systems. And so instead of keeping the user's best interests in mind, we're actually arsenalizing our knowledge of the user against them to try to get them to do the thing that we want. Another follow-up definition comes in 2020 from Narayan and colleagues at Princeton, where they describe user interfaces that benefit an online service by leading users into making decisions they would not otherwise make. There are also legal definitions of dark patterns. I will not go into those here, but they're pretty much in parallel with what you're seeing here, just with fancier language. One of the key interesting differences, though, and we'll come back to it a little bit later when we describe the impact of law and regulation, is that the law does not require that you prove intent to say that you have been that a consumer has been deceived. And so when we talk about intent in these definitions, it's really important when we're talking to designers to say, you shouldn't do those things, and you should be aware of how users might misinterpret those cues or how they might feel manipulated, coerced, or deceived. But for the court, it actually doesn't matter. It's a nice extra, but it is not core to the legal definitions. And in fact, the CCPA from California specifically indicates regardless of a business's intent. So I'm going to talk through a few different themes today, and we're going to start out with this idea of complexity. We know our work is complicated, but there are lots of ways in which us as design theorists and scholars have actually looked into why is design so complicated. It's not just this magical world. We can actually understand it a little bit better as well. And the first form of complexity that we all experience as designers is what is referred to as design complexity. So when you're thinking about the work that you're doing on an everyday basis, you're huddled around with team members, you're working on complex projects with small budgets and quick deadlines. A lot of what you're experiencing can be illustrated through this lens of design complexity. So this is your subjective experience of what is complicated. And it's experienced across a number of different variables within that context. So it's about like, what is the nature of the task? What is the nature of your specific situations? What kind of domain of work are you doing? And what is your professional skill, competence, and experience? And so you could probably imagine something that was really complicated for you 5 or 10 years ago, if you've been in the industry for a while, might be something that you don't have to think about too much now. Your intuition, or what we commonly think of as our intuition, tells us what to do and how to do it, or at least gives us a heuristic sense of where we could start. But for newer designers or designers that are confronting new things, Michelle and I were just talking about how educators responded to the threats of COVID-19, for instance, where suddenly you have to throw the playbook out the window. You feel this complexity and you feel it at your very core. So we know that design work is complicated. There isn't one guidebook that can just tell you all the ways of what you should do and how you should do it. In the late 2010s, as we were starting to look at why do designers do bad things, we also coined this idea of ethical complexity or ethical design complexity. And this is essentially recognizing that as designers, we're often asked to do things that maybe we don't want to do, or we feel a little bit uncomfortable about, or we feel like we need more information to find out whether that's actually in the best interests of users or society or both. And so we created this diagram to indicate that as designers, we have lots of forces that are acting on us that influence our decision-making and even influence our awareness. So those individual practices that we rely upon, the decisions that we can make, the actions that we can take. But we also have applied ethics standards. So we might think about what if everyone did this? Or what are the potential harmful consequences if people misuse this system? And then we also have organizational practices. What does your organization value? What are the kinds of processes that they have to make sure that products are not harmful, or maybe they're so focused on building the bottom line that they're sort of okay with potential user harm? like many big tech companies that we can definitely chat about if you'd like. And here's a definition for you, again, a little bit more academic, but I think you get the point from the example that I just shared. So that by ethical design complexity, it's something that's always happening. It's not just like this is the point where an ethical decision was made. It was that ethics is constantly mediating all these different things that are happening to you and through you as a designer through the lens of your organization, individual practices, and ethical frameworks. So interestingly, we've looked at some of these practices before, and we can understand why some of those practices are so complicated and difficult to understand. This was conducted about 6 or 7 years ago, but we were looking at why do design students do bad things in this case. So we gave them 3 different design protocols to work on, really authentic prompts, starting with, can we manipulate people for good to donate to a nonprofit? Second one, can we do preferential treatment for products, which happens all the time on the internet? And then the third one was essentially working with privacy policies and emerging technologies. At that point, it was voice user interface technologies like Alexa to identify, what are ways that you can manipulate consumers into giving away more information than they might choose otherwise. And what we found through this process, we actually looked carefully at all the transcripts and all the different kinds of collaborative decision making that were happening and used certain kinds of role and sequence analysis to understand how they were engaging with the problems that they were solving, but also the solutions they were posing, and then figuring out how they came to consensus or not. And we ended up discovering a number of different ethically nuanced design roles, which hopefully will help you see how the ethical design complexity comes into action. And we found 2 broad kinds of roles that were really relevant for the conversation. The solution-focused roles were focused on how people engaged in manipulative practices by actually creating the solution themselves, whether they be through sketches or another form of prototype, to really recognize like, ooh, we can nag somebody until they do the thing that we want them to do. Or we can be a puppeteer. We can sort of control them from up above and get them to do what we want, just like some of those dark patterns examples I showed you earlier, but very grounded in the solution itself. There were other people, though, that were very rationale focused. And these were people that they were focusing on making their solutions or their approach sound reasonable. And so in one case, we had the justifier, where they were able to make something sound rational and reasonable, while we had the capitalist who was appealing to the fact that we live in a capitalist society. And so it's okay to get profit, even though we might be getting it through a means which might be slightly problematic. You can see a couple of examples here, like the puppeteer, where they're designing a task flow to encourage, steer, or nudge a user to perform a certain path, specifically because it benefits the shareholders' goals. There's another example here. We can look at the diluter, where they're designing solutions that dilute the manipulative or persuasive nature of a solution by reframing the manipulation rather than discarding it completely. And so in this case, they don't like the access because we're really trying to soften the creepativity with this. So they're not trying to remove the creepativity, which is a great word. They just want to soften it to make it less offensive. With those rationale-focused roles, we also saw a couple of interesting things. With the justifier, there were many ways that they were doing that justifying work. They were saying, like, we're doing it by the book. This is exactly like the normal way of approaching this design pattern in e-commerce systems. Or they might say, there are ways to manipulate people's empathy, but it's okay to do that. It's our job as designers to impact people's emotions. And interestingly here, some of these were really direct challenges to users' autonomy. And the fact that they had their own preferences as well. So for that Alexa example, they said, and this is the top quote, I don't think we can put a pop-up saying, can we listen to your part of a conversation? I would say no, personally. And then they're able to very much say, okay, they go, yes, it's quick, it's fast for them. They don't really know. They're still in the dark. The user's kept in the dark and move on. So there's this moment where the designer realizes there's an ethical tension in play. They might not even be thinking about it in terms of privacy, but just about like, ooh, this would be sort of problematic for me, but maybe this is what the shareholder's asking me to do. So I'm going to keep the user in the dark. So this has all led us, some of this is a little bit older work, but I think it still rings very true with what we hear from designers, even to this very day. But a lot of what we've been focusing on in my lab over the last couple of years is trying to understand what are the new threats and new opportunities that we can gain when we look at all this interesting work that's happening in the legal and regulatory space. And you might be, rightfully so, rolling your eyes right now. If you had listened to me say that a decade ago, I probably would have been rolling my eyes at myself. Um, I don't know that of many designers that really love to talk about law and regulation. But interestingly, early in my dark patterns work, a lot of the questions that I would get is like, yes, we know these practices, we know they're bad, we know they're harmful. How can we push back in our company and say no? And back in 2018, 2019, all I could offer was to say, well, hopefully you can have a reasoned conversation. You can talk about your brand value and that we know that some of these patterns break down or hurt brand value. And we also know that users are bothered by these kinds of patterns. But ultimately, the choice is you either do it or you leave your job. Now, these days, we actually have a lot of regulatory frameworks and different kinds of regulatory action that have occurred just over the last 5 years or so that actually give us new tools to do something with. And so this is part of a larger project that we're engaging with around knowledge complexity, which naturally builds on what I've already described about design complexity more generally, and then ethical complexity as well. So when you think about knowledge complexity, it sounds really like academic and maybe a little bit dry. And this slide probably does the work for you to say plurality of epistemologies. This is often how we talk about the fact that we have many different kinds of knowledge we rely upon and many different methods to build that knowledge in academic research. That's the epistemology, the way that we know something. And so these are some of the ways that we know things within human-computer interaction as a scholarly field. But as many of you have experienced in design, it's not just like you need one little bit of expertise. You actually need many different forms of expertise that come together to support your work in meaningful ways. And so we can also talk about this as a plurality of domain knowledge. And so this comes from a diagram from 2006, really at the start of UX design, saying, UX designers, they need to have social knowledge, they need to have design knowledge, they need to have business knowledge, and they need to have computing or technical knowledge to be successful. And all of this is still the case. Like even with the onset of AI, this is still definitely the case. We also know that there's a plurality of practitioner knowledge. And I spent a lot of time in the late 2010s, early 2020s, studying with my collaborator, Yubo Ko, how people share knowledge in online communities like Reddit and Stack Exchange. And so this is a diagram of all the different forms of knowledge that are being generated through these question and answer communities. And we can actually detect interesting changes over time in what concentration of topics seem to be hot or interesting and which ones are on the decline that relate to different parts of UX work. And there's more work that shows that actually this is an unsolved and continuing practice. And we call this a community of volatile practice. It means that the community is constantly changing its norms and understanding what is relevant to design work, and it's not stable. In fact, it's constantly evolving. So when we talk about knowledge complexity, then we are talking about this active process that every design practitioner is engaging with, where they're wrangling multiple forms of knowledge. And that wrangling is really important because it's this active like contestation that's occurring. We're constantly seeing chaos and complexity around us, and we're figuring out like, what are the different knowledge sources that make sense here? Who do they make sense for? So these different limitations and strengths that inform those practitioners' design decisions and their outcomes. And critically here, we're not saying this is the knowledge form that is important and all the rest of these are unimportant. We're actually trying to say there's this wide range of knowledge types. We found over 17, in fact, in our investigation. And so one of the really interesting questions is how do you orchestrate all those different knowledge forms together to convince the people that need to be convinced and also bring in new forms of knowledge like that legal and regulatory knowledge. So that brings us to thinking about where this intersects with the dark patterns literature. There's been a lot of stuff that's been happening over the last few years. If maybe as a designer you weren't aware that dark patterns were being discussed in this level of detail, just this could be like a nice starter reading list for all of you. So back in 2021, we looked at consent banners and the ways that design and the law sort of intersect, and how they are really challenging to find the tensions and opportunities between the law. Ruben Kirkham's work looked at incorporating different jurisprudence standards from the EU and relating them to values that we want to uphold in design. We also have Richmond Wong's work with colleagues looking at how specific legal frameworks like GDPR and the CCPA show up in how companies think about risk internally. We also have Steve Jackson and colleagues talking about how policy can impact some of these situations as well. And then finally, we have some of this more recent work that was presented last summer, looking at how UX practitioners currently engage with law and regulation or might predict doing so in the future. So what this gives us is essentially a new emergent form of complexity. So we have this knowledge complexity, which is where our focus is right now, but we also have this design complexity and this ethical complexity. And so one of the questions that we might ask is, what can we learn about design complexity through the lens of ethics, which is what I've spent a lot of my career doing. But we can also look at what forms of design complexity can we investigate further, because we know there are these wide forms of knowledge forms in play. And then also, based on what we've learned about ethics over the years, how can we use that to inform the situation as well? For instance, what could it be like as a design practitioner when you have ethical awareness, but you actually need new forms of knowledge to be able to convince somebody else that that ethical awareness is meaningful or should impact the bottom line or business decisions? So when we think about dark patterns, there's a lot going on. And so if you aren't aware of the term, or you haven't seen it come up very much, go into Google News or another news aggregator, just type in dark patterns. There are articles coming out almost every day regarding certain kinds of allegations of dark patterns, or fines because people have used dark patterns, or new regulation that's trying to address dark patterns. And when I use that term at a high level, these are the 5 types that you want to be aware of. These are 5 different strategies that are commonly in play. And we've already talked about a couple of them. We've talked about interface interference, where there was that false hierarchy or the manipulation of the choice architecture. We talked a little bit about sneaking, where there was that hidden information that caused people to make uninformed choices. And we even talked about forced action. So where you had to click that accept all button on the website with that consent wall because they didn't provide you an option to say no. But there are 2 other types here that are also important to bring into the conversation. One of them is obstruction, which is essentially taking something that should be simple and making it much more complicated than it needs to be, like unsubscribing from services. And then social engineering. So thinking about all the different ways that we can feel left out or feel like we are not doing the right thing. And so think about when you go to an e-commerce website and it says only 5 of these left, or 3 people are viewing this hotel room right now. We have these sort of primal urges to rely on some of those triggers around scarcity and urgency to make some of our decisions. And these can be particularly profound for younger teens and children, where they're still trying to figure out what it means to fit in as well. If you want to do a deeper dive, go ahead and scan this QR code. And because we've published an entire ontology of dark patterns, it has a bunch of different components at 3 different levels. I've just described the very top levels. And this aligns all of these dark pattern types with not only academic literature, but also regulatory reports. So every time you see a magenta block on there, that means it's an academic source that we're relying upon. And all of those cyan sources are regulatory reports from the US, the UK, and the EU. And so across all these, you can start to see, oh, there's regulatory interest happening in a lot of these different spaces. This is a great cheat sheet to maybe take to a meeting where your company is engaging with some of these deceptive practices, and maybe they should consider doing something different because these are illegal under statute. So now that we've talked a little bit about knowledge complexity and dark patterns, we'll try to link some of those ideas together a little bit more for you in the context of that new project that I've been describing. So here's what we did. This is still ongoing work. We interviewed some practitioners and we spent a long time chatting with them, wide range of practitioners in a wide range of industries with different kinds of lived experience. We did some case study analysis to understand how practitioners acknowledge or lack awareness of legal or regulatory knowledge as part of their work practices. And then we also did some other vignette and reflexive thematic analysis to better understand what's happening. And in particular, to document what are the forms or types or genres of knowledge that people mention when they're describing their work practices. And we ended up seeing three really distinct cases that emerged from some of our work. We had Jacob, who, these are pseudonyms, obviously, who worked for a small mobile app company and was just wanted to do the right thing, but was really completely unaware that there were regulatory issues at play that could impact their work in positive ways. We also had somebody like Conrad, who was a UX designer for an automobile manufacturer, and he was very aware of the impacts of regulation on practices, both in good and bad ways. Some of it was, I see the user benefit, but others were like, I can't collect the user data that I used to be able to do my work appropriately, or my company doesn't allow me to do that. And finally, we had Amy, which has seemed to be one of the most consistent cases where they know that there's a legal team over there somewhere, but there's no real form of direct engagement. There's this strong delegation of legal issues to others within the organization. And it's really focused on doing compliant work, but you as a designer aren't necessarily responsible for that compliance yourself. And across these interviews that we conducted, we found out a number of different starter provocations that we're still seeking to answer, but I think are useful to maybe share here as well. So one is, how is legal knowledge integrated along many other forms of UX knowledge, which I'll show you in just a second. Does the size or type of organization matter? Or are there differences in legal scrutiny if you're working for a fintech firm or a health firm versus maybe an e-commerce company? Are there ways for these legal and regulatory frameworks to actually help UX practitioners get their way more often? And how does that maybe happen? And how could or can legal knowledge shape organizational or design practices? That's more the optimistic, future-oriented work that we have planned. Show you a couple of vignettes just to illustrate that what you're experiencing as design complexity and knowledge complexity is real, and we're starting to document why that is the case. So in this case, there was somebody that was talking about their work at a social media company, and it concludes by saying, so individually, we try to handle some of these issues within our own sphere, asking questions like, is this going to be problematic? So there's some clear ethical considerations, but also potential legal considerations in that quote. In this other quote, which is much longer, and I don't expect you to read, they were talking about the different ways that the legal team might engage with some of their work and some of the questions that they might ask, and some of the knowledge sources that they might use to engage in some of that conversation. And what we did here is actually illustrate what all the different forms of knowledge are that are in play. So you have stuff like the liability and the actual harm, which is really coming from the legal vocabulary, but we're describing that as other disciplinary knowledge. You have these work practices around how are we going to react to that? Let's sit down and figure that out. That's more experiential knowledge. We also have this interpersonal work knowledge, which has been generated about how you gain alignment from shareholders, how you engage in empathy-inducing narratives that work with your team. And then you also have methods, which are really core to a lot of design work, like personas, user journey maps, and blueprints. And all of them have their role in crafting this overall narrative that this designer was sharing about their work. I'll show you one more example, just to illustrate some of this in action. In this case, we have somebody saying, GDPR was really drastic in impacting our work. And it's not how I learned it. It's not what I stand for. So basically, it was impacting their user research work practices in ways they were really frustrated with. And so they're happy about GDPR existing for some reasons, but saying it's completely against my own motivations and morals. And they're not able to do the user-centered work they want to do. So you have the interplay of legal and regulatory knowledge and its impact on work practices. You have this other organizational team knowledge, that the way company envisions that this work should be done. And then this declarative knowledge to say, it's not how I learned it. So here's what I learned in school about how you do good UX research, and I'm not able to do that anymore. And the normative knowledge, it's not what I stand for. So let me walk you through a little bit of how this looks as these worlds start to intersect. We started this work with looking at consent banners back in 2021. I mentioned that a little bit, and we showed an example of a consent wall earlier. And here's one of the outcomes of that research, where we identified, like, here's a consent task flow that you can follow. There's the initial framing, which is what you see on the screen. It could be either a wall, or you go into this configuration mode where you can say, here's what I want to do and here's how I want to do it. And then I finally accept. And across each one of those, there are consent requirements which come from the law and GDPR. So, like, you have to give the consent freely, or it has to be specific or informed, or it has to be revocable, which, by the way, most are not revocable. You can't take them away online. And then we also align dark pattern strategies that actually were implicated in some of these decisions. So some of them, like that consent wall, involve forced action, while others might just block your use of the site in certain ways, or maybe result in reduced service, or might just make it much more complicated to configure the cookie banner in the ways that you want to. So definitely an intersection between the law, between dark patterns and design here, in ways that are still being worked out in many cases. As another example of this playing out, in some of our other work from 2021, we recognize that people don't just experience deception like in one moment, where it's like that button is problematic, like in the screenshots I showed you earlier. It's also problematic when we see that we have this felt experience of being manipulated that can happen across a really wide time scale. And so here we've talked about it as these initial impression stages, where it's where you go to a website and immediately you choose sort of a vibe check to say, do I trust this site enough to continue shopping here? Or I'm concerned about what they might be doing with my data. Or, oh no, this feels legitimate, this feels real. So we have that initial judgment, we have this inspection of the details where we start to look for inconsistencies. And then we have these moments where we're starting to feel, ooh, this site is trying to persuade me to do something. Maybe it had a popover trying to get me to sign up for a coupon code with my email address, even though I just went to the site and I don't even know what they're offering yet. There are other forms of felt manipulation which happen after you've interacted with the site a bit. So some of these could be like your general conclusions. So you've interacted through these a few moments, and then you recognize, like, look, this is not going to be the site for me. I'm not comfortable giving out my information anymore. Or it could be that you actually come up against an undesired interaction, where maybe you've recognized, ooh, that company, I'm going to go with the e-commerce example because we've been playing around with that. You get to your cart and you realize they have snuck a new item in there. Maybe it's an insurance protection plan or something like that. And so that's an undesired action where you recognize, ooh, they're doing things which are not in my best interest. And then finally, some of these might be negative results from interaction that are experienced far in the future, like Amazon Prime, where you accidentally signed up and you realize 6 months later you get a bill, or you've been billed for the last 6 months and you didn't even realize you signed up in the first place. And so felt manipulation as a topic is really broad and difficult to sort of attach ourselves to as well. To address this, we've come up with a new methodology. We're publishing on it this year. I'll share a link in just a minute, where we've looked at how you can evaluate for these kinds of deceptive and manipulative components across 3 different timescales. And as designers, we design with time in mind in many ways. And so we started with just an annotated wireframe. We have a screen, we have some things that we're going to call out, and we're going to indicate where dark patterns are in play. And then, of course, we could link that to law and regulation as well. Now, you'll notice what's on the screen is actually the Amazon Prime unsubscription flow. There's a reason for this. First, we've done a lot of evaluation of this specific case. But because this talk is about the intersection of design and regulation and law, this is a really nice example where those worlds automatically meet. The FTC a couple of years ago filed suit against Amazon, alleging that Amazon Prime used illegitimate tactics to reduce friction to get users to sign up for Prime, like in one of the examples I showed you previously, and that they made it extraordinarily difficult to unsubscribe from Amazon Prime. The net impact being that many consumers stayed signed up even if they didn't want to be, and many consumers that wanted to cancel the service were unsuccessful in doing so. And you'll appreciate the irony. They called the flow that you had to go through to unsubscribe the Iliad flow, named after Homer's sort of epic, impossible journey. This was the internal code name for the project. So you're just seeing the first page or two here, but we're able to identify that there are some things happening on this page that are worth focusing on. So from a design perspective internally at Amazon, they might ask, what are the metrics that are most compelling to users that are going to convince them or persuade them that this product is worth buying? We could also ask a question like, okay, people want to indicate that they want to cancel the service. How many steps are needed to circumvent users' pursuit of their goals? So how long does the Iliad flow need to be for people to give up? Because we want to keep them on the service, unethical as it might be. And we might also ask, what are the social cues that were considered and tested? Because we know with these kinds of systems, they're constantly doing A/B tests to optimize for certain kinds of behaviors. And certainly they're the ones that have a company's interest in mind, not necessarily the end users. So that's at the page level, where we can look at individual components and call them out as maybe potentially problematic due to their use of dark patterns. We can also look at it over this experience of time as well. And so in this case, we have the 3 main pages of the Iliad flow. And you can see at the bottom, there are all these different kinds of dark patterns that we've identified. Some of these appear on single pages, like I've described previously, but many of them occur over time. Probably the most obvious one is obstruction, where they are creating barriers and adding steps to something which should be much simpler to accomplish. And we can ask other questions through this kind of analysis, like how do users know when their decision is final? We actually learned in our research that many users got only halfway through this process, and then they thought that they had canceled, but in fact they had not fully completed the process that Amazon had set out for them. You can also ask how many steps were needed to circumvent users' pursuit of their goal, and then what forms of personalization are legitimate to use, and in what ways to persuade users to do something. So there's one additional level that we can go at. For those of you that do UX or product management work, you might recognize bits of this as a modified service blueprint. And so this is where we're trying to account for many touch points over a service, where there are different customer actions that are performed. Those are the different columns. And then there are things that are visible to the user that they're able to interact with. Those are the front stage actions, but there are also business systems that are involved, which involve backstage actions and supporting processes and systems that make this all happen as well. And so we can identify here that it's really easy to subscribe to Amazon Prime. I showed you how simple it is to just say yes and sort of avoid the fact that you don't know what all the terms and conditions are. And this is part of the Prime subscription process. And they commonly did it through an interstitial upsell or bundling to make it easy to add on as part of the normal checkout flow. Then the next thing that you might want to do is recognize, ooh, I accidentally signed up for something that I didn't want to. I got a billing notification on my credit card. So I want to identify the path to unsubscribe. And that was actually quite challenging for many users as well. And then finally, if they want to complete the unsubscription flow process, they have to go through that entire Iliad flow that I mentioned. The backstage actions are really engaging with different forms of membership retention. And there were lots of different forms of social engineering, forced action, obstruction, and interface interference that were at play. This case is still pending. It's going to be tried in court in the fall of 2025. But one thing I've learned about the legal process is that it takes a long time to work through the process. This is 2 years in the making, and it's still not done. If you are interested in the method and some of these examples played out in a little bit more detail, I'll be heading to Japan on Friday to present some of this work at the CHI conference, which is the largest conference for human-computer interaction scholarship, but it's available to you all as well if you want to take a look. I want to close by really thinking about what this means from a legal and regulatory perspective when we're thinking about what we can do as designers. And one thing is just to look at the news. This was just back in October. This is just now coming into force, where the Federal Trade Commission announced their click to cancel rule, which essentially made what Amazon did here illegal under statute. This is a specific rule that essentially says to all of us as designers and developers that if we make it more difficult to unsubscribe from something than it was to subscribe to it, then we are now running afoul of the law. Very cool to have that in our back pocket. So if you've ever signed up for a Planet Fitness subscription, I haven't, but many of my friends have, and then you've really struggled to unsubscribe from it, these are those kinds of actions in play. And you can also see the power of regulation as well. Little hack, if you have a Planet Fitness subscription and you can't go to the location that you signed up, go into the portal and change your location to anywhere in California. because California has more regulatory protections for you, suddenly a magical unsubscribe button will show up for you that wouldn't show up if you were registered in any other state. So these are those weird spaces where the design world and the regulatory world actually enhance each other. Final thing that I want to mention is really talking a little bit about the legal questions around some of these and what you can learn as designers through this process that can hopefully motivate us to do things differently. Back at the heart of the pandemic, I was called upon to be an expert witness in a legal case. This was brand new to me at the time, and it was a little bit scary to figure this out. But I was able to look at a lot of different materials internal to Google. There's a report that you can actually access in redacted form, but I was able to look at discovery. I was able to analyze lots of internal reports. And they tried to exclude my testimony because that's what you do in a court of law. And the case eventually settled for $85 million. Google ended up paying out over $750 million on these various cases, and there's still one in process, at least one in process in the state of Texas. Importantly for this conversation, I was able to actually use a lot of my design experience to understand how these flows happen over time and how they capture users' attention. And I was able to also look at the user studies to show that actually Google knew a lot about users' concerns with their products, and they didn't really do a lot about it. And there were many of these different forms of manipulation of the user flow that impacted user behavior in really dramatic ways. And that led me to what I'm going to share finally, which is essentially, what can you all do about it? Well, knowing that some of these legal frameworks exist are going to be really helpful for you in some of your future work. There's certainly regulatory regimes in the US that can be useful, but also ones that are being developed in the EU that are going to impact products, particularly if they're multinational. And to support these ethical forms of engagement more generally, though, we ended up creating this set of designer intentions. These are things that you come across probably in your everyday work. Like, I want to evaluate my design outcomes. I want to see if I'm being like ethical and value centered in my work. Or I know that there's something wrong with there's something wrong with the system. I just can't see it yet. I want to break my design work before it gets broken by actual users and maybe results in really harmful practices. We first put this online. So we created a little website, everydayethics.uxp2.com/methods. You can go there, it's all free. You can hang out, you can look at these different intentions and then also see what different methods might support some of those actions. But then more recently, we have also compiled a lot of those resources into a book, which is now out. It was just published at the beginning of the month. Looks like this. And it has a lot of that same information in really visual, easy to follow format, so that hopefully you can do two things in your everyday work. Going back to that message of ethical complexity and knowledge complexity I started with. First, we know your work is already complicated as practitioners and as educators. Second, we know that some people actually struggle just to be aware that there are ethical issues in play already. And so you might need to help some of your colleagues do some of that work through some of these methods. And then finally, once you are ethically aware, you still have to figure out how you might be able to act. And that's where that knowledge complexity can come into play, not only helping you be aware of the many different ways that you can convince people with different kinds of empirical data or different kinds of design methods, but also where increasingly the law and regulatory frameworks might be useful in convincing some people there are some better ways to make products that customers are going to love, that are also going to be above legal scrutiny. And hopefully we're thinking about that societal impact and not just the business's bottom line. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to conclude here, but I'd love to engage in any of the questions that you may have.
You guys are welcome to go ahead and ask your questions. Down at the bottom, there's a Q&A right beside where it's there should be like a hand and then a chair. So you'll see the Q&A there, and then that's where you can go in and type in your questions, and we'll see that. You can also put it in the chat. All right. Well, it doesn't seem to be that we have any questions. So, but if you guys do end up having any questions, you're welcome to message me, and I'll get that information to Colin. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for lending us your expertise, Colin, especially during a time where there's so much going on, and when it comes to using your phone and trying to like get a subscription, like people like you making that process easier and non-manipulative, something we are all thankful for. This is and then Q&A. Sorry. And before you go, I just want to highlight to anybody who's still here, the Indiana Donor Network panel. They're unveiling this stunning memorial that honors 25,000 Hoosiers that are organ and donor donators. And so they saved over 1.3 million lives. And then artist that's local, Quincy Owens, ended up making this 4-story tree of life. And there's an immersive element to it, and all about legacy, healing, and connection. It's very moving. You don't want to miss it. It's going to be tomorrow. Have fun. Come to the rest of our events. Hope to see you there. And thank you for being a part of today's session. We hope to see you at more events, you guys. Thank you so much.